Hello and welcome to this NPTEL course entitled Trauma and Literature. We were looking at Virginia Woolf's novel Mrs. Dalloway. So we've already had a series of lectures on it. So we just carried on where we left last time, which is introduction of the principal traumatized character in the story, which is Septimus Smith. Now we discussed that Septimus Smith suffers from PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, which is something which happens a lot to soldiers when they come back from the war, and they cannot integrate back essentially into the civilian space. So the trauma of Septimus Smith is essentially an experience in disintegration, and this disintegration is medical, of course, but equally it is social, it is existential, and also it is quite political. So we saw last time where we stopped the point how there was an essential feeling of waste in Septimus. He looks at himself as a wasted leftover from the war. And this feeling of being a leftover, the feeling of being not functional, this knowledge of non-functionality is what informs his melancholia. And I'm using the word melancholia in a very classic Freudian sense. Melancholia as a sense of self-loathing. The ego is depleted. The subject loathes itself, hates itself, and is disgusted with itself because of its non-functionality. And it is obviously accompanied with a sense of purposelessness. And a purposelessness is something which we see increasingly in Septimus. He doesn't know what to do. He's completely dazed out, and he's just completely directionless. He doesn't have any direction in the future. So in a very interesting sense, Septimus could also be interpreted, or the experience of Septimus could be interpreted as something which is out of sync with time, because it is also, there's a degree of non-synchronicity with time. He cannot merge into time. He cannot merge into the space-time in a post-war metropolis. So space-time becomes a capsule, becomes a compound, a chronotop, if you will. And this inability to integrate through the chronotop is something which informs Septimus's trauma, which is, as I mentioned, an experience essentially in disintegration. Now, interestingly, Septimus is married to a woman called Lucrezia, who's an Italian girl, and she is someone who's an outsider to London. And so what we have here is different kinds of outsiderness, different orders, different ontology of outsiderness. So Septimus, who is British, but he feels like an outsider in London because of the war, because in a post-war London there's no place for someone like him, and no one can empathize with him. He's just a leftover from the war. He's someone who didn't die, someone who survived the war, right? So he doesn't have any empathetic gaze on him. There's no one that he can connect to, and so there's a sense of being an outsider. Lucrezia, his wife, is quite politically an outsider. She's an Italian girl, and of course, being an Italian also means she was on the other side of the war with England. So that degree of outsiderness is also there. So we have different kinds of outsiderness operating almost simultaneously in this novel. And the most interesting thing, of course, is the outsiderness of Clarissa Dalloway, who is otherwise a very privileged, white, wealthy woman, very British, very privileged, very white, very wealthy. She's about to throw a very posh party where some of the most distinguished people in London are to be invited to come. But despite that, she's a complete outsider to all her activities. There's a sense of alienation that she suffers as well. So the outsider quality is something which we need to really tap into in this novel quite extensively. So, as Lucrezia says, let us go on Septimus as his wife, a little woman with large eyes and a sallow, pointed face, an Italian girl. But Lucrezia herself could not help looking at the motor car and the tree patterns on the blinds. Was it a queen there? The queen going shopping? So we saw how in the previous lecture there was this motor car explosion, and in some sense, and people suspected there was someone very, very important in the car, perhaps a member of the royalty, member from the royal family. They weren't quite sure, right? So, and this whole idea of peeping into something in a metropolis with half knowledge becomes quite symbolic. We don't quite know, we don't quite have a sense of identity in London, in a very fast-moving metropolis. Everything is half said, half articulated, half shown, half known, right? And the sense of almost this translucent quality, something between transparent and opaque. This translucence is something which characterizes the post-war metropolis, and nothing is quite known. Nothing is never quite fully known, right? So that becomes, and that obviously makes it quite liminal as well. So, but her husband, for they have been married for 5 years now, started and said, all right, angrily, as if she had interrupted him. People must notice, people must see. People, she thought, looking at the crowd, staring at the motor car, the English people with the children and the horses and the clothes, which she admired in a way. But there were people now, because Septimus had said, I will kill myself. An awful thing to say. Suppose they heard him. She looked at the crowd. Help, help. She wanted to cry out to the butcher's boys and women, help. Only last autumn, she and Septimus had stood on the embankment, wrapped in the same cloak, and Septimus reading a paper instead of talking. She had snatched it from him, and laughed in the old man's face, who saw them. But failure one conceals. She must take him away into some park. Now we will cross, she said. She had a right to his arm, though it was without feeling. He would give her, who was so simple, so impulsive, only 24, with our friends in England, who had left Italy for his sake, a piece of bone. Right, so this image is very important for us, a piece of bone, something which doesn't have flesh, something which doesn't have life in it, something which doesn't have any animation. This is completely a non-animated object, something which is dead, essentially, a piece of fossil. So Septimus over here is a piece of bone. It's something which is drying away, something which is dead already, something which is fossilizing. And this is something which is very unfair to Lucrezia, because A, she's an outsider, she's an Italian, and she married him out of love, and she left everything for him, essentially, to come to London, which is a strange city for him. And now he himself is an outsider over here. He's disintegrated, he's thinking of committing suicide. So she feels doubly alienated, A, politically, and also B, existentially, linguistically, culturally, in every sense of the term. She is very, very alienated, very, very cut off from the surroundings. So the piece of bone imagery is interesting, is an important piece, it's an important symbol that, she is, trying to clutch his arm because she has a right to his arm. She's married to him, so, legally, emotionally, she has a right to his arm. But then his arm is not really an arm, it's a piece of bone, which is to say symbolically that he is essentially a dead person, a zombie, a leftover from the war, right? And this feeling of being a leftover is something which we see it's a recursive thing in Mrs. Dalloway. He's someone who isn't quite dead, but is not quite alive either. There's this liminal location. It's almost like Dante's hell before you die. There's this lake you have to cross. So Septimus in London becomes almost this sea of oblivion before you can go to the other world, right? So he's somewhere stuck between life and death. So London becomes this translucent liminal landscape for Septimus. Okay, okay, now we come to the next section of the novel that we will pay some attention to in details, and that is the Skywriting aeroplane. So this is an advertisement aeroplane, an aeroplane presumably advertising for toffee in London. And that becomes an important symbol because, like the Big Ben, we talked about the Big Ben in the last class, the giant, massive clock in London, which chimes in every time there's an hour. It was 12 o'clock or 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock. The Big Ben chimes in. And the chiming of the Big Ben obviously is announcement of clock time in some sense, which cuts into people's reveries, which cuts into people's epiphanies, which makes everything standardized and uniform. It's a production of uniformity, Big Ben, uniform time, uniform temporality, because that time is shared by everyone. That time is spread across. It's more of a distributive order of time, supposedly democratic. But what it also does, it becomes this tyrannical time, the normative time, or shall we say the chrononormative order. Chrono is time, normative is obviously hegemonic. The hegemonic time, which consumes and subsumes all other psychological locations in time, people's reveries, people's dreams, people's aspirations, people's desires, which are their own psychological time. That has all been consumed by the announcement of Big Ben. So Big Ben in this novel is very much a very patriarchal order of hegemonic time, chrononormative construct, an architecture of chrononormative order. So something similar happens with the skywriting plane. The skywriting plane wanders across the London sky and is almost equidistant from everyone observing it. But to each person it's a different thing. And to Septimus, of course, this becomes a very traumatic reminder in some sense of a bombing airplane. Maybe, he's thinking Okay, so this chrononormative order is important, and so this visual order is important, right? So the fact that everything is equidistant, everything is positioned equally from that skywriting aeroplane is important for us to understand. So Mrs. Coates looked up into the sky, and it's interesting how some seemingly minor characters in Mrs. Dalloway become important. Mrs. Coates, for example, over here, is just a minor character, but she notices the plane for the first time. She spots the plane for the first time, and the spotting becomes important, right, in some sense. The sound of an aeroplane bowed ominously into the ears of the crowd, so ominous being a very important word. They was coming over the trees, letting out white smoke from behind, which curled and twisted, actually writing something, making letters in the sky. Everyone looked up. So, and I was writing something in the sky. Everyone looked up, and like you mentioned, the plane is almost equidistant from every observer, and as equidistance becomes important, the fact that everything becomes sort of objectively spread, and everyone looking at the plane is equally distant from it, and the plane is writing something which can be seen from every position in London. So these factors become important over here. Dropping dead down the aeroplane, soared straight up, curved in a loop, raced, sank, rose, and whatever it did, wherever it went, out fluttered behind it a thick ruffled bar of white smoke, which curled and writhed upon the sky in letters. But what letters? A, C was it, an E, then an L. Only for a moment did it lie still. Then they moved and melted and were rubbed out up in the sky, and the aeroplane shot further away, and again in a fresh space of sky began writing a K, an E, and Y, perhaps. So quite literally we have letters coming after each other, and then there's a formation of word, a formation of meaning. So quite literally this is a meaning production in a fast-consuming post-war metropolis. And you can see how London in this novel is a very highly consuming metropolis. Everyone's consuming everything, and it's trying to move on from the traumatic landscape very quickly. So we have advertisements coming in, and different modes of consumption are in air. The skywriting aeroplane obviously is something which is advertising for something, seducing people to buy it, etc. So the seduction process is something which is always there. But interestingly, we will see how the same aeroplane will mean something very different to Septimus Smith, because that will remind him in some sense of his trauma, of his experience in the trenches, which is obviously very, very traumatic, very dark, very ominous. So the word ominous is already there, as you can see, and the skywriting aeroplane, which is otherwise an innocuous instrument of advertisement, will be perceived by Septimus as something which is ominous, something which is bad foreboding, something which is a carrier of violence, of destruction. Okay, an E and Y perhaps. Glaxo, said Mrs. Coates in a strained, awe-stricken voice, gazing straight up, and a baby lying stiff and white in her arms gazed straight up. So everyone's gazing at the aeroplane. An aeroplane, obviously, it has a godlike gaze on the metropolis as well. It's looking down at the metropolis. Creamer, murmured Mrs. Bletchley, like a sleepwalker. Again, very important word, sleepwalker. So there is this zombie quality, there's this somnambulistic quality about the walkers in London. They're not quite away from the trauma. So despite the fact that there's machines of advertisements, machines of consumption, machines of production, the spectral quality of the word, the spectral quality of trauma is very much there as a lingering presence. So the sleepwalker metaphor is important. And because Woolf is such a fine writer, we need to pay attention to all these little details, very subtle hints that she's dropping. With his hat held out perfectly, still in his hand, Mrs. Bowley gazed straight up. I mean, look at the number of times the word gaze comes there. And obviously someone like Woolf would only use the word very, very deliberately. There's nothing casual about this. So she obviously wants to say something, wants to convey something. All down the mall, people were standing and looking up into the sky. As I looked, the whole world became perfectly silent, and a flight of gulls crossed the sky, first one gull leading, then another, and in this extraordinary silence and peace, in its pallor and its purity, bells struck 11 times, the sound fading up there among the gulls. So as we can see, this is a very, very complex audio-visual image and something very cinematic about it. And Woolf, like most modernists of her times, most of her contemporaries, was quite fascinated by cinema. Cinema was a new mode of expression back then. So a lot of the writing drew a lot from cinema, the cinematic techniques of the visual consumption, visual production, visual narratives, etc. So as we can see, so the gulls crossing the sky one by one become a very important image, and there's a silence, there's a spell, everyone just shuts up, everyone quietens down, everyone looks at the sky as it is some kind of a divine design happening. But what is also quite there conspicuously is the fact that there is that spectral quality of war. So there is a residual, lingering presence of war, something which is a carrier of velocity, something which is, which forebodes evil, destruction, etc. Right. So this extraordinary silence is not quite a silence of fascination. It's also a silence of anticipation, a silence which is ominous in quality, a silence which is spectral in quality, a silence which is, something which is about to suffer. So that quality of suffering violence, that quality of suffering, this velocity that comes with violence is very much there. So despite the fact that this is a skywriting aeroplane advertising toffee, there is that quality of violence, there's this quality of destruction about it, which is never quite far away. Okay, so the aeroplane turned and raced and swooped exactly what it liked, swiftly, free like a skater. So swooping, again, there's a gull-like quality, a violent quality about the aeroplane, which is very much there. There's an E, said Mrs. Bletchley, or a dancer. It's toffee, murmured Mrs. Bowley, and the car went into the gates and nobody looked at it, and shutting off the smoke, away and away it rushed, and the smoke faded and assembled itself around the broad white shapes of the clouds. It had gone. It was behind the clouds. There was no sound. The clouds to which the letters E, G, or L had attached themselves moved freely, as if destined to cross from west to east on a mission of the greatest importance which would never be revealed. And yet certainly so it was, a mission of the greatest importance. Then suddenly, as a train comes out of a tunnel, the aeroplane rushed out of the clouds again. The sound boring into the ears of all the people in the mall, in a Green Park, in Piccadilly, in Regent Street, in Regent's Park, and a bar of smoke curved behind it and dropped down. And it soared up and wrote one letter after another. But what word was it writing? So we can see there's not much of a difference between the violent aeroplane of destruction and the advertisement aeroplane of consumption. The borderlines are quite blurred in some sense. But what is also important is the unpredictability of the movement. No one quite knows whether it's gone or it's coming back, if it's recursive, whether it make a reappearance. We don't quite know. And also what we don't know yet is what word was it writing. So in some sense, this aeroplane becomes a very interesting reflection of the unknowability of meaning in a post-war metropolis. We don't quite know what a word means. We don't quite know how meanings are formed. So the very formation of a word which would have a meaning potentially, which can be consumed, the unknowability of it becomes interesting over here. As the letters come one after the other in the little letters of clouds, and then they form together and form one word, which is a toffee name, which is an advertisement name. But the point is, people don't quite know what it is. And now we have Septimus looking at it. Lucrezia and Warren Smith, sitting by husband's side on the seat in Regent's Park in a broad walk, looked up. Look, look, Septimus, she cried, for Dr. Holmes had told her to make her husband, who had nothing whatsoever seriously the matter with him, but was a little out of sorts, take an interest in things outside himself. So this is a very important little commentary. So again, this very oblique references, this blink and miss references are very important in Woolf, because it's actually very packed. She said, oh, Dr. Holmes, who is one of the physicians treating Septimus, had said, apparently, very arrogantly, there's nothing wrong with Septimus, he's just a little out of sorts. So again, we have a very interesting welding, as it were, between patriarchy and medicine, between masculinity and medicine. So these male doctors seem to know everything about the traumatic patient, and they can declare very, very emphatically that there's nothing wrong with them, very arrogantly. And there is obviously an autobiographical reference to be teased out of this, because Woolf herself was a sufferer of depression, as some of you would know. And our own doctors, one of them was called George Savage, unfortunately, again, had a very similar attitude towards her in terms of not declaring, not acknowledging that she is sick, not acknowledging that she is ill. And she was prescribed a very heavy diet of milk and bananas to gain weight. So there is that empathy that Woolf has as a writer towards Septimus. We can see it because Dr. Holmes and the other doctor, someone called Bradshaw, they declare quite arrogantly and quite certainly there's nothing wrong with Septimus. And again, and that obviously makes it more complex for him, because the denial of any problem, the rejection of any problem, is something which makes it even more accentuated for Septimus, shall we say. So they prescribe that Septimus should take a look outside of himself. So, according to them, Septimus's problem is a problem of self-absorption. He's too absorbed with himself, absorbed with his ego. So he's been asked to step outside of his ego in some sense. And that's something which has been conveyed to his wife, and she's passively following the doctor's orders, so to speak. So, thought Septimus, looking up, they're signaling to me, not needed in actual words. That is, he could not read the language yet, but it was plain enough. This beauty, this exquisite beauty, and tears filled his eyes as he looked at the smoke, words languishing and melting in the sky and bestowing upon him in the inexhaustible charity and laughing goodness, one shape after another of unimaginable beauty, and signaling their intention to provide him for nothing, forever, for looking merely with beauty, more beauty. Tears ran down his cheeks. So we can see the sense of being overwhelmed by Septimus, in Septimus. He's always overwhelmed with emotion. And we will find later, why is he emoting so unpredictably, so overtly, and we find that this has come from a long experience in repression. He has been trained to repress his feelings as a man, as a soldier. That's a training, that's an emotional training he's received. And now, right now, when he is breaking, when he's caving in, when he's fragile, he's overcompensating for that in some sense, right? So this is an example of overcompensation, that he is actually, overtly emoting, and that it becomes a problem. It was toffee. They were advertising toffee. A nursemaid told Lucrezia. Together they began to spell T-O-F. K-R, said the nursemaid, and Septimus heard her say K-R, close to his ear, deeply, softly, like a mellow organ, but with a roughness and a voice like a grasshopper's, which rasped his spine deliciously and sent running up into his brain waves of sound, which, concursing, broke. So we have a very good example, a very good description of the cognitive system. It's a slowed down process, a decelerated process, a defamiliarized process. And this, again, a very conceptual take on trauma. Trauma as an experience in defamiliarization. Your normal cognitive process is defamiliarized, it's decelerated, slowed down, it's reshaped. And everything, every sound, every image, every word around him comes to you, comes to the traumatic person, traumatic subject in different shapes and different diagrams and different designs. So for Septimus, the whole experience is just intensified in some sense, and his spinal cord it just takes it in, the nervous system, his cognitive system takes it and absorbs it completely, right? And we're told that the brain, it hits his brain, the waves hit his brain, and concursing, it breaks. So they give in, they cave in some sense. A marvelous discovery indeed, that a human voice in certain atmospheric conditions, for one must be scientific above everything else, above all scientific, can quicken trees into life. So again, the human brain is a magnificent machine. Again, the scientific rhetoric is used, but it's also parodied in some sense, because this, in a way, this entire novel can be seen as a critique of science, as a critique of biomedical science, which seems to know everything, which seems to be certain about the human problems, whereas the human emotions are infinitely more complex than what the bioscience can predict or formulate. Happily, Lucrezia put her hand with a tremendous weight on his knee, so that he was weighed down, transfixed, all the excitement of the elm trees rising and falling, with the leaves alight, and the color thinning and thickening from blue to green to of a hollow wave, like plumes in horses' heads, feathers in ladies. So proudly they rose and fell, so superbly they would have made him mad, sent him mad, but he would not go mad. He would shut his eyes, he would see no more. So I'll stop at this point today, but there seems to be a synesthetic quality about Septimus, and by synesthesia I mean the condition where different sense perceptions crisscross each other. So what you can see, you can also smell that. What you can smell, you can also touch. So the tactile sense, the olfactory sense, the everything, just the visual sense, everything just coalesces together, and it becomes a very complex system of perception and reception. So, and that becomes too much to take for him, and he just caves in and he shuts himself down. He shut his eyes, he would see no more. So that becomes the only act of agency that he has, the only motor act of agency that he can exhibit. He can shut himself down, because there seems to be he's a very fragile person emotionally, and then every emotion to him comes to him with a lot of intensity, with a lot of defamiliarized diagram, defamiliarized design. So everything to him is an experience, is a moving experience, is an overwhelming experience. So there's only so much he can take. So he shuts himself down as a subject. And this, again, I'm going to close at this point, but this decision to shut yourself down, this decision to shut down your senses, is something which anticipates his eventual suicide, which can also be seen as an act of shutting down the system, right? So his suicide at the end of the novel is also can be seen as an act of agency, the only agency available to him, because he's so repressed, he's so hunted down by the biomedical practitioners, by the doctors. No one seems to understand him. His complete lack of empathy pushes him towards the only active agency available to him, which is active suicide, which is something which is anticipated by the decision to shut down his senses. So let's stop at this point today, and we'll carry on with this text in the next lectures. Thank you for your attention.